Well, that's our reading. Those opening 18 verses are known, certainly amongst Christian theologians, as the prologue to John's Gospel, the setting the scene. There are key things that we need to know, to understand, to recognize before we embark on the rest of John's Gospel. And central to that is the simple, clear, but incredibly profound statement that Jesus Christ is God. The opening verse there, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Things are attributed to this one who's referred to here as being the Word, which are uniquely in Scripture attributed to God and to God alone. Verse 3, through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. All that takes us right back to the very first book of the Bible, the book of Genesis. In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And we saw that John is using this term, which is translated here into English as the Word. In the Greek it was the word logos, and logos meant certain things to the Greeks, and it also meant certain things to the Jews. And it was a real step of genius of bringing those two things together under the inspiration of the Spirit, those two phrases that pointed to the principle, at least, that there should be order in the universe and that God is not silent, that he speaks. And those two things are brought together and used to point to Jesus Christ. There is more than order in the universe. There is one who is in control of all things. And John is telling us here, amazingly and remarkably, that this same one came and lived amongst us. But he goes on to tell us, which we looked at last week, that the world did not recognize him and his own did not receive him. And so there is this sort of default setting, and you see it in the Gospels, of ultimately keeping Jesus at arm's length. At best, an outright rejection and desire to destroy him at worst. I guess you see that in our world today, don't you? It's fascinating and it's tragic that at Christmas time, when there is so much celebration in our nation, and yet the great reality that is missing from all the celebrations is even an acknowledgement that this is about the birth of Jesus Christ. It seems sometimes that our culture wants to go out of its way to deliberately shun Christ and to distort even the Christian message. And yet, of course, he is, to use that terribly overused phrase, he is the reason for the season. And central to Christmas is the news of the birth of Jesus. And how important it is that we as Christians acknowledge that and take this good news, for it is good news, out into our world, so that boys and girls and men and women may not only enjoy the celebrations that our culture enjoys at this time of year, they may also come to know him, which is the greatest thing of all. Well, all that we've looked at so far in many ways comes together. It's a bit like a magnifying glass, sort of pulling everything together and focusing it into that spot in verse 14. The Word became flesh. That, by the way, was a staggering statement for the Greeks, who believed that anything to do with matter and the flesh and the body, at least some of the Greek philosophers believed this, was of no consequence at best, and some might have even regarded it as evil. And yet here is this staggering news that the one who is God became flesh, became a human being. And it goes on, verse 14, to tell us that he made his dwelling amongst us. It's actually the word we would use for a tent. He pitched his tent amongst us. He got involved with us. And it is a remarkable statement, that. And then John goes on in verse 14, we've seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Now, just for a few moments, let's pause with those words in verse 14, because they are staggering words. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. We have seen his glory. And the great point John wants us to know is that Jesus Christ, who is God, who has come to us as one of us, comes as one who is approachable and accessible. I don't know if you've seen over the years some of the paintings, some of the classic paintings of the Nativity. I was looking for some pictures for the service to use in the service tonight, and looking for art depicting the birth of Jesus. And it's also unapproachable. There are these sort of mystical paintings, particularly some of the older paintings of the infant Christ lying in the manger with this sort of dazzling halo, and it's all trying to convey a message, of course, a theological message, that it's more than just a human child that's there, but it's God as well. But at the same time, it's often presented as one who is unapproachable, one who is so mystical and so above us that in the end we can only stand at a distance and admire from a distance. And yet John tells us here, the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. And when we read on in the Gospels, we see this so clearly. He becomes one of us. He becomes an ordinary working man living in a tiny village in the north of Israel. And he makes himself accessible. And this, of course, is central to the good news of Jesus. He is sent, not that we should admire him from a distance, but he is sent that we should approach him and that we should know him and that we should be able to delight in him. Well, at the end of verse 14, there's a little phrase, and it uses two words which are picked up also in verse 17. And this is the basis of what we're going to look at this morning. We're going to explore these two words. It tells us that the Word that became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us, Jesus, who displayed his glory to us, is one who is also full of grace and truth. Grace and truth. If you jump down to verse 17, a little contrast is given there. The law came through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. Grace and truth. So the picture you have in the prologue, very simply, very powerfully, is that John is telling us that Jesus is God. He has come to us. We haven't recognized him. We, by definition, don't receive him. And yet he has come to bring grace and truth. Now, if you need to understand what Christianity is really about, these two words are really probably the most helpful in understanding what Christianity is really about. Grace and truth. They're words that connect very much with our culture today. They're words that speak to us, and yet at the same time they are words that need careful defining, because it's very easy to misunderstand what John is indicating here by these words, grace and truth. Now, definitions are really important, aren't they? A few weeks ago, there was a radio program on BBC Wales. They have like a religious affairs program on a Sunday called All Things Considered. Some of the episodes are very, very good. Some, like today, are clearly quite bizarre. But there was one a few weeks ago on the hymn Amazing Grace, which I'm sure every one of us here in the service and online has heard that hymn many, many times. And there were all sorts of people talking about, a little bit about John Newton, about its connection with the emancipation of slavery and kind of civil rights in the States particularly, and there were all sorts of things being said. But nowhere in 30 minutes of that program did anyone define what grace was, which seems a bit disappointing, at least, shall we say. And I think the assumption, the reason is that often people make assumptions about this word. And for a lot of people today, if we went out into the town and said, what does grace mean? Well, they'd say it's a girl's name. Some might say, well, it's something that people do say perhaps before a meal or something like that. And some who've been around church for a while, they might say, well, it's to do with a blessing the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and so on. It's often a benediction that's used at the end of the service. John is speaking about something far more precise when he speaks about grace and truth coming through Jesus Christ. John Newton kind of got it right when he said amazing grace. Because grace is a word that takes us to something that is, when you really begin to glimpse it, it is almost too wonderful for words, which makes preaching on it a little bit of a challenge, doesn't it? It's interesting in our hymn books, and particularly older hymn books, how downright excited some hymn writers got about grace. There's a really old hymn, and it's in the idiom of the day. Grace, 'tis a charming sound, harmonious to the ears. There's a hymn writer getting really excited back in his day, using his language in his day. And grace is something to be excited about when you really glimpse it and understand it. Because grace points us to the wonderful work of God in the life of a sinner. The wonderful work of God in the life of a sinner. At which point, two things need clarifying if you're really to understand grace. When I first started preaching quite a long time ago now, and it was there was an illustration that was doing the rounds to explain this relationship between the need to understand what sin is and who God is if we're really to understand grace. And the illustration went like this. If you go to a jeweler's to buy maybe a very expensive piece of jewelry, it's upmarket jewelers, maybe a ring, an engagement ring or something like that, the first thing the jeweler would do would be to put down on the glass table a black cloth. Now, a black cloth, if you were to give that to your when you're proposing to someone, they wouldn't be very pleased at all. But the black cloth is very important because as the jeweler would lay the rings out, the black cloth accentuates the splendor of the jewelry. And if we're to understand something of the splendor of grace, we need to understand that grace takes place in a context, and that context is our sinfulness. And as well as our sinfulness, you actually can't talk about sin without talking about the holiness and the righteousness of God. You see, our understanding of grace actually begins with the question, what is God like? Now, for a lot of people in our culture, God is rather like Father Christmas. He gets trotted out once a year, or at important times, or something like that. But it's this kind of benevolent character from another world who's only there to cheer us up and kind of rubber stamp our lives. A number of times I've heard people say, well, if there's a God, I'm sure he looks at me and this is what he thinks, da-da-da-da-da. If we actually take seriously what the Bible says about God, we come to some very different conclusions. That the starting point is that God is holy. Now, what does that mean? It basically means that he is completely different from you and from me. That he's pure. He's perfect in all of his ways. And he is eternal. And there are many other things we can say, but perhaps amongst the other things that we could say, we would have to say is that he is righteous. Now, that's a slightly difficult word for us, but what does righteous mean? It means that he is right in all of his ways, in his nature, in his character, in his works, and in his ways. Now, when you think, if God is like that, what are you like? And I can tell you now, even if I don't know much about you, I can tell you now, you're not like that. Because none of us are. Instead, we are creatures of this world. We're not eternal. We're finite. At least we have a beginning. But more than that, we are people who, by definition, fail It's not a verse of the Bible, but in many ways you think it could be. But that old saying, to err is to be human. And we understand that. We look at the world, you hear somebody's messed up and they've got something wrong, or you hear about the amount of shoplifting going on in the UK now is just going through the roof, and businesses just shrug their shoulders. It's human nature. If people have got an opportunity to get away with something, they'll get away with it. It's just what we like. And we are, aren't we? The point is, we are completely different from God. Now, if you want to understand grace, we really have to come face to face with the reality of who we are. Because God has spoken into our world, and that's what verse 17 is about, where it says that the law was given through Moses. Now, Moses is a great character in the Old Testament who God raised up to lead his people out of a slow, systematic genocide that was being unleashed upon them by the Egyptians into a place of safety. He was a great leader. But within the life of Moses, there came a point when God gave to Moses to give to his people what the Bible simply refers to as the law. We know the essence of the law as the Ten Commandments. And when you look honestly at the Ten Commandments, and if you really look at it honestly, there isn't one of us here who has not broken every single one of those commandments. And that's not because we're a weird bunch that happen to get together in this corner of Llanelli on a Sunday. It's true of every human being everywhere and in every generation. And you might say, well, what in the world is the point of God giving a law that he knew we would all break? Surely the purpose of the law is to keep the law. But actually the purpose of God's law is to show us that we're not like God, that as good as we think we are a people who consistently go our own way. And that puts us in a very different category to God. But more than that, the Bible goes on to tell us it puts you and me under the judgment of God. And that's why that word law is important. Because when laws are broken, justice comes into action. At least it should. And judgments are made. Now that's the black cloth. We're not like God. We've broken his laws. We're under his justice. And we deserve his judgment. But the wonderful news is that grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. There's a lovely, beautiful verse in the New Testament where it simply says of Jesus that he came not to condemn, but to save. Stunning words. Because you look at our world today, and it's like the world 2,000 years ago. A world filled with injustice. A world where people will exploit other human beings. A world of greed. A world where it is so easy to make other human beings suffer, whether with words or with actions. All the terrible things that were going on, it would have been so easy for Jesus Christ to come, the one who is the Word, who is from the beginning, the one who is God, the one who has made all things, and simply to condemn. And you know deep down in your heart that that would have been fair. When you look at the world, and if you're a brave woman or a brave man today and you're really honest before God, you would also have to say that it would be perfectly fair for God to condemn you. But he came not to condemn. And that's amazing news, isn't it? He came to rescue. He came to intervene into the chaos of our sinfulness and our rebellion. And this takes us to this wonderful word grace, because quite frankly, we don't deserve the intervention that God has brought. We deserve condemnation. Our leaders deserve it. You deserve it. I deserve it. That's what we deserve. But he was sent to give us not what we deserve, but instead an invitation to forgiveness and renewal and redemption. Grace takes us to the heart of God. The God who we've offended, the God who we've rejected, the God who we've insisted on not recognizing, the God who we've dethroned and placed ourselves on the throne as human beings, the very same one came into our world to offer forgiveness and restoration. And this begins to take us in the direction of what John means here when he says about Jesus being full of grace and truth. And there are so many lovely stories in the Gospels, aren't there, of people who deserve to have the book thrown at them. I mean, they're everywhere when you begin to look for them. We're going to actually hear a little bit about a lady tonight who was caught in the act of adultery. And the crowd were baying for her blood. And she deserved it. And Jesus had mercy and sent her on her way with his words of forgiveness ringing in her ears. I always think of Peter, foot-in-mouth Peter, the boldest of all the disciples. Speak first, think later, Peter. And there they are in the upper room, all gathered together. Lord, if this lot were to run away, I won't. I'll be with you. And Jesus simply says, listen, Peter, by the morning you'll have denied me 3 times. That's exactly what happens. And then following the death and the resurrection of Jesus from the dead, there comes that moment when he gathers all his disciples together. They don't recognize him at first. They're in a boat. He's on the beach, and they get out the boat and realize it's Jesus, and he's got breakfast ready for them. And they're all there, and there's this awful, must have been this terrible, terrible awkwardness in the air, at least amongst the thinking disciples, and certainly amongst Peter. After all, he denied having anything to do with Jesus with curses, the New Testament tells us, to a little servant girl. And then there comes a moment when they're probably finished breakfast and wondering what they're going to do, and Jesus turns to Peter and he says, Peter, do you love me? And at which point, in my mind, you kind of see all the other disciples slinking away. And what Jesus delivers to Peter isn't condemnation, it isn't criticism, but it's full restoration. And that's grace. And you might be someone today, whether you're joining us online or here in the building, whose life is so chaotic, and you feel that you've kind of really dug your heels in when it comes to God. And for most of your life, you've lived as if he isn't there. When it said that the world, when Jesus came, didn't recognize him. And you say, that's me. You know, if what John is saying here is true, that Jesus born in Bethlehem is actually God coming to us. I've lived most of my life as if that wasn't true. I've lived for myself. I've had a great life, a fun life, an interesting life, but I've just done my own thing. But it's not condemnation that he comes to bring to you. It's grace. And though you may have kept him at arm's length for most of your life, though you may have mainly in your life uttered his name as a blasphemy, it is nevertheless grace that he offers you. You see, one of the lovely things Jesus once said was this: it's not the righteous I've come to call, but sinners to repentance. He has come for people like me, who've broken his laws, who fail him regularly, and who left to my own devices would simply live for myself. And he's come for someone like you who's just the same. The grace of God. Later in the New Testament, the Apostle Paul will write a great deal about grace. And in fact, he kind of pulls it all together in a letter he wrote to the church at Ephesus. He says, it is by grace, that which you did not deserve, could not merit, could not earn. It is by grace you have been saved through faith. For what Jesus Christ requires of you today is that you do recognize him and you do receive him, and that you recognize him and receive him by faith. That the staggering news that the one who is God became man, lived amongst us, and the full exercise of his grace ultimately was he died for you on the cross. That all of your sins, all of your unrighteousness, all of the dreadful things that trouble you might be completely, totally, thoroughly, for eternity, washed away, taken away, never, ever to return. And he did that, says Paul in his letter to the Ephesians, by grace. And he calls you today to believe that. You see, the news of the birth of Jesus is good news. It's not a creator coming back to condemn, but is God coming back to redeem, to save, and to rescue. And maybe today you know that you're in need of this rescuing. His arms are open to you today, and he invites you to believe on his name and to put your faith and your trust in him. And you know that's only the beginning. Because in verse 16 it says, from the fullness of his grace we have all received one blessing after another. And you know the great thing about when you become a Christian? You realize, I didn't deserve this. Charles Wesley wrote a great hymn. He wrote many great hymns, but he wrote a hymn the day after he became a Christian. The hymn begins like this. And can it be that I should gain an interest in his blood? Died he for me, who caused his pain? For me, who him to death pursued. Amazing love. How can it be that thou, my God, shouldst die for me? And you see, in the Christian life, when you become a Christian, it is like that. It's like, what in the world? That he's forgiven me? What am I doing here? What am I doing stood up here, talking to you today like this? It's the amazing grace of God. And it's only the beginning. Because the Christian is able to point to so many times when as a Christian they've messed up, and so many times when knowing all about the love of God, knowing all about the mercy of God, and yet I've still done this. I've still messed up. I've still failed. And you see the great thing about grace, as he says in verse 16, it is from the fullness of his grace. God is not tight. From the fullness of his grace, we all receive one blessing after another. Grace just keeps flowing and flowing and flowing into the life of the believer. It's an amazing thing. And you as a Christian today, you don't look back to the grace of God. You're in it right now. And it is the grace of God that is propelling your life. And as old Newton said, it is the grace of God that ultimately will see you home. The grace of God is an amazing thing. God is not this benevolent Father Christmas. He is the almighty, holy, righteous one who came into our world, embraced our humanity, became a man of sorrows, familiar with grief, died on that cross. That is not some cuddly, cozy, passive thing. He went all the way to Calvary for you, that you might receive his forgiveness, and he delights to forgive. You might be here today or online thinking, I don't think God could really forgive me. I remember being terribly disturbed when I was working as a physiotherapist in a cancer hospital in Cardiff, and I had an opportunity to talk to one of the patients one day about the faith, and he just held up his hands like this. And he said, if you knew, young man, what these hands had done, you would never speak to me of the forgiveness of God. And it can be like that in us. We can sometimes think that we're too bad. We're too confused. What we have done is beyond help. And you know what? That is a lie. It's a lie. Grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. And verse 14 tells us when he came, he is full of grace and truth. And that last bit, truth, is important. Of course it is. It's an important word for today, isn't it? You see, sin confuses us. We declare ourselves to be masters of our own destiny, our own fate as human beings. We are the ones who'll work it out. We're so optimistic as human beings. Do you get that? We're always on the brink of a new discovery, or we're going to, another lot of politicians, they'll work it out. Or another COP 28, 29, 30, 50, 60, 70, 80 thing, whatever. In the end, we'll get the environmental thing sorted out. We just need to pull together. But we don't, do we? And with 2,000 years of history and many other years of history preceding that show again and again and again and again, we as human beings, for all the trumpeting of our own abilities to sort things out, fail again and again and again. The basic problems in life we cannot solve. Again, when I was working, I worked in psychiatry. I remember a ward round one day, and a man had been found in a terrible state in Cardiff. He tried to take his own life, and they brought him in. It was acute admission ward. He was there. And I can remember the consultant saying, this poor man's problem is he's lonely. And that's all it is. And there's really nothing we can do. He's not mentally ill. He's lonely. And the problem of loneliness has been a problem amongst us as human beings since the beginning. It's a problem in our world today. We can't solve it. The most basic, elementary problems, we cannot solve them. Why do I do it? What can it be? And it's against the confusion of humanity that Jesus comes, full of grace and truth. You want to know why you are? Do you know, Christianity makes absolute sense. It really does. It says you as a human being are part of a world with a systemic problem that it will never solve. Read history, you'll get that. It also tells us that you as a human being are special and different from the rest of creation. You long for more that is found in this world and in this life. And it is. It is. Remember, things have gone on in your life and you've set yourself up and you think, oh, this is the way, this relationship, this person, this promotion, this experience is going to bring absolute satisfaction. Popular music is full of allusions to this. I still haven't found what I'm looking for. I can't get no satisfaction. You know, those hymns are written by multi-millionaires. And it's the truth. And yet there's this thing deep down inside that there should be more to life than this. And the thing you plan for and you work for and you achieve it and you get it and it's great for a little while and then it's like dust in your hands. And you've got to go after the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. Remember when I ran my first marathon, everybody says, oh, that moment when you cross the line, it's an amazing moment. It's the best feeling in the world. And I got there and I thought, it's okay. It's okay. Do you know what? Literally, it wasn't quite the same day, but the next day I was thinking of the next one I've got to run. And the one after that. We're always running, looking for that thing. Why are we like that? The simple answer the gospel shows us is you've been made in the image and likeness of God, and the whole of your life in the end will be a chasing after rainbows unless you come to understand and to receive that there is real fulfillment in Jesus Christ and in Jesus Christ alone. Christianity makes sense. The desire in us as human beings to be righteous, it's very much there. If you don't believe me, go on X or Twitter as it used to be called. Everybody wants to be in the right. Everybody wants it to be condemning others. At least that's how it seems. We want to be considered righteous, but we can't find it. In Jesus Christ is not only real spiritual fulfillment, but there is real righteousness. Because the righteousness you receive when you become a Christian isn't, oh, I go to church now. I got a big floppy Bible. I pray 3 times a day. That's not righteousness. In fact, sometimes that can be religious hypocrisy. No, the righteousness you receive when you become a Christian is Christ's own righteousness. Because he looks at you and he says, I know what you're like. You're a sinner. You mess up all the time, and there's no way I'm going to tell you to, now you've trusted in me, you carry on, and you've got to keep your nose clean and tick all the boxes and all that, and if you do that, everything will be okay. He doesn't say that to us. It would be terribly cruel if he had. No, what he says is, listen, I tell you what, you know what? I've done it all for you. I've kept every righteous requirement of the law of God. I've been tempted in the same way as you have, but the difference is I never sinned. And you know what? I love you so much. You can have as a present the gift of my perfect, eternal righteousness. And Paul, when he wrote to the church at Rome, he described it in terms of it being like a robe, which is draped upon our shoulders, a royal robe. The robe of Christ's righteousness. But when he offers us that, he offers to take from us the rags of our unrighteousness, which he takes to Calvary, and by his death on the cross, permanently, eternally carries away. Jesus Christ is full of grace and full of truth. And so when he speaks, we must listen. We must hear what he's got to say against the backdrop of all the ideas of the philosophers, the thinkers, the entertainers, the comedians, and your own voice. You must listen to what Jesus is saying. And you say, well, where do I start? I'll tell you where you start. You start here with this. We hear him say this to you today. Come to me. Come to me. That's where you start. You need to know that. That's what he's saying to you. Come to me. With all your confusion, all your questions, all your hurt, all your suffering, all the stuff inside of you, your shame and guilt and memories of the past, the mess-ups you've made. Come as you are. But more importantly than that, come to me. Jesus Christ is full of grace and full of truth. And that's why the news that he has been born amongst us is great and glorious news. We're going to sing to close this service this morning. Christ is come, let earth adore him. God appears in mortal frame. We'll stand to sing his praise.